organizations. I'm Guilherme Canella, Regional Advisor for issues on freedom of expression for Latin America and the Caribbean. And actually, my colleague, Shang Hong, that is the person behind this effort, will introduce you to those publications. I'm just responsible for sharing this session and guaranteeing that we'll be out of here when the next colleagues arrive for the next sessions. But before giving the floor to Shang Hong, I must share with you a nightmare that I had last night. I was like, during my nightmare, I waked up and then I opened the window of my hotel room, and this tree from the Lord of the Rings, those trees that speak, the Ents, you know, those that the hobbits go to defeat Saruman, he was looking at me, and I opened the window because I was curious. And he had lots of UNESCO publications, and he started throwing the publications at me and said, "You're incompetent people, you started killing trees to produce those things that no one reads." And they said, "Oh my God." So, of course, I will discuss this with my shrink later, but I will urge you, especially the people that will share this session with us, that how we can really make those things useful, and I will be more comfortable in discussing this issue with my shrink next week in Montevideo. So, Shang Hong.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, by starting session by laughter. And I'm so happy to be here, particularly because some of the authors of this year's publication are also here, like Andrew, who has done the book on the privacy and free expression, and Rebecca has done the very interesting one on the intermediaries. Actually, the history sometimes came from the accident. We started the first book in 2009. At the time, it's just a pilot exploration into the online free expression. We try to look at a broader context since there are so many challenges than traditional media world. Then we found we just couldn't stop because the internet is evolving so quickly and so many issues are intertwined. They are changing every day. So eventually we're producing a series. It's really very spontaneous but also very relevant because our member states, our stakeholders, policymakers, they urgently need a quick update on what's happening on the ground. So the first book, although it's 2009, still, the framework it has shaped is still valid. And the second book, this one I'm very proud because when we commissioned Andrew and his team to write about it, it's far early before the Snowden revelation. We look at the issue between the privacy and the free expression, which was very, very well cited by the UN Special Rapporteur in his report and also many other stakeholders. And the third edition is Rebecca and her team has done for us because the internet company intermediaries became a new gatekeeper in the internet. And also it's our really first time to seriously think about a strategy to work with the companies. And the recent one is on the digital safety. UNESCO is leading the UN Action Plan on Safety of Journalists. This is a digital pilot. The most recent one is a counter online hate speech, which I can see at IGF is also becoming more and more discussed. The unique thing is that we are really recommending a more soft, more social approach rather than a very hard counter strategy to deal with hate speech rather than compromising free expression. And this is one is really hot. It's just printed. It's the most recent copy. We have reviewed 55 internet governance principles, and also we assess our new concept, internet universality, under all this existing initiative. And the good news is that yesterday, the UNESCO General Conference, the CI Commission, has initially endorsed this concept of internet universality. So it's really good news, which means that we are taking a wider mandate and we are be full-fledged in internet governance ecosystem. All in all, these are contribute to this UNESCO comprehensive internet study, and we have cultivated the process by organizing a Connecting Dots conference in March, and some of you are there or there too. So that's represent our so far efforts. And we are having some new editions in the pipelines. For example, yesterday we organized, the day before yesterday, we organized a workshop on balancing privacy and transparency. Transparency is a part of free expression in our concept. And we are also going to publish a new research about the source protection of journalism. And so here, I think I have 1 minute. I think I will finish in 30 seconds. So I really like to have our panelists and participants to give us some suggestions, both for the current versions and also for the future subject. What do you think deserve to produce a new edition on the UNESCO Internet Freedom Series? Thank you.
Thank you, Shanghong. And just to let you know that the Internet study, we already, with the support with our Category 2 Center here in São Paulo, we already translated that document into Portuguese and Spanish. It's just passing through final revision, so will be soon available in those 2 languages. And the first 2 publications of the series, Freedom of Connection and Internet Privacy, will also be available in Spanish quite soon. So just warn you on the multilingualism function of UNESCO is also operating in this process. So according to the instructions I received from Shanghong, the next speaker is Eduardo Bertoni, who will have 3 minutes for trying to let me be less afraid of my nightmare.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. Let me start saying that for me it was a pleasure to contribute in some of this paper in different ways. And I only have 3 minutes. Maybe I will use less than 3 minutes because it's a very short session. And I wanted to highlight the importance of this kind of reports coming from particularly UNESCO, not only for the activism that is working for more freedom of expression online, privacy, safety for journalists, but also for the academic sector. And this is what I want to highlight today. I am now a law professor in Buenos Aires University at NYU University. I'm also a director of an academic research center in Argentina. And these kind of reports that not only provide information but also provide guidelines are very useful for my classes. Particularly all of the topics that were touched in this report are topics that it is not always possible to find literature, new literature, and literature coming from an organization like UNESCO. You can find, of course, a lot of academic papers, but when you start digging on soft law, international standards, and these kind of things, of course, there are reports coming, for example, from the special rapporteurs that are also very useful, but this kind of information that UNESCO has been publishing during the last years proved to me to be very, very useful. So, Guilherme, don't worry about the trees. So, students are benefit for this publication. Let me say one thing coming up to my mind when we discussed with some colleagues or with some students. One of the topics that has been touched here in one of the last reports, which is the online hate speech report. This is one of the most sensitive and complicated issues to solve. And in my view, it should be very welcome that UNESCO decided to include this topic in the publications. I have 30 seconds, so the only thing that I want to raise about this report is that it's going to be under huge debate because, as I said, the topic is complicated. And when we are thinking about the implementation of Article 20 of the ICCPR, it's complicated to make this article compatible with freedom of expression standards. And UNESCO and other organizations try to do that in this report. So congratulations to UNESCO, and thank you very much from my academic perspective.
Thank you, Eduardo. So one way for us not feeling guilty for killing trees is that those things can be used in universities or teaching students, and this is one good use, according to Eduardo. So Rebecca, your perspective, perhaps you also could share with us in doing the work you do, building indicators, how this kind of standard setting publications could be useful also to dialogue with the kind of work you do. Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Well, I think it's great that you were dreaming about Ents last night, because they're my favorite character in The Lord of the Rings. And there's one thing that the Ent said to the Hobbit, which is, don't be hasty. And that in winning the war, against the evil forces in The Lord of the Rings, is about laying down roots. It's about digging deep. It's about sort of permeating and laying a foundation to actually prevail. And in a way, I think this kind of evidence-based research and recommendations and indicator development, I mean, we're facing real challenges to freedom of expression and openness around the world. The internet, just by existing, we found that we really need to think hard about how do we promote, protect, and shore up and expand freedom of expression globally in the internet age. And it requires a lot of kind of hard and deliberate work if we're going to, I think, get the policy understanding and changes that we want. And so I was really thrilled to be involved with the Internet Intermediaries study, and that UNESCO for the first time is looking at the private sector actors, which are a new sphere for creating a new sphere for speech, and also a sphere for governance of speech and how that interacts with government sovereignty. And so in our report, we really looked at it from a framework of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, where governments have the primary duty to protect human rights, but corporations, companies, have a responsibility to respect human rights. And it was within that framework that we looked at how states are influencing internet intermediaries in then shaping what people can and cannot say and access online. And then what sphere in which the intermediaries have their own control in shaping what people can do. And we came out with a set of recommendations that people can read, but they're really sort of recommendations that I think apply both with the hate speech issues and various solutions that people are trying to apply to the online sphere, that policies and legal frameworks need to be developed in a context of multi-stakeholder consultation, need to be consistent with human rights principles, that self-regulatory frameworks need to be accountable and transparent when intermediaries are asked to regulate kind of in an extra-legal fashion, that both government and companies need to maximize transparency about what content is being restricted. There needs to be adequate grievance mechanisms, and so on. And so the indicators, the work for UNESCO actually helped inform this other project that I've been doing, Ranking Digital Rights, where we developed indicators to evaluate companies on free expression and privacy criteria. And it's really looking at these very types of questions. Do companies have grievance mechanisms? How transparent are they being about what they're restricting, what requests they're receiving, how they're processing, how they interact with government, and how they control their own spheres of influence over companies. And so I think we're in, I think, a phase where there's quite a number of different groups working to develop indicators and figure out how to institutionalize them and find ways to get international sort of credibility for them. And so I'm very much looking forward to working with UNESCO on that. One final point, and this is one of the recommendations for further work that we made in our own report, has to do with the need for more kind of user studies, user surveys. And this is, of course, not easy work to do and is always resource intensive, but one of the things that we lack, I think, enough empirical data on is how intermediaries' choices are affecting individuals on the ground in different types of jurisdictions and different legal, regulatory, cultural contexts, and how regulations of the internet are affecting individuals, and to do some really in-depth studies of users in different places, and how law, corporate practice, and individual experience intersect. And I think that might help bolster arguments in support of certain types of standards and indicators. So that's my suggestion.
Thanks a lot for the suggestion. So it's not only useful for academic work, but also for other stakeholders, so the regulators, because you made recommendation to those, but also to the private sector. So we see here, but it's a kind of guideline, and I don't know if you note the difference with other UNESCO publications. They are very short books. The idea is exactly to work like policy papers, because another part of the end nightmare is when we publish those 400-page books that no one reads, and then you enter a room in Paris and all the colleagues have those below their monitors just to make their monitors higher. So I said, oh my God, what is our production, intellectual production going to? So Andrew, you also work with other several stakeholders, foundations, and civil society organizations, and I would like your comments on how those publications could be useful for this kind of stakeholders as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Guilherme. Obviously, I was part of a team that put together UNESCO's publication on privacy and freedom of expression, and I think it's probably fair to say that when we worked on that, we didn't have an idea of how topical and dominant the issue would become in the subsequent months following the Snowden revelations. The paper itself tries to look at how, I mean, first of all, the premise, and something I found quite interesting when I began to look at this in detail, is that privacy has always been shaped by technology. The idea that there is a notion of privacy that endures throughout human history in some unchanged fashion actually is not the case. Privacy itself is very hard to define. Everyone has some sense that it's to do with their personality and dignity, but the way in which we think about it and articulate it, paper that actually discusses privacy, it's actually pretty recent. It's the end of the 19th century. It's a Warren and Brandeis paper written for the Harvard Law Review, which I think was because one of the two authors didn't like his family's pictures appearing in the local newspaper. He was from an eminent Boston family, which was a subject of great interest to the local media, who are always photographing people coming to and fro. He took offence at his photograph being taken and shown in a newspaper, said, actually, I've got a right to privacy, which is now fairly extraordinary. Most of us, if you look at Facebook, Twitter, or newspapers, the idea that our pictures appear in a newspaper would be unproblematic, is my guess, to anybody in this room, unless they're a dissident or on the run or a criminal. And yet that was actually seen as a violation of people's privacy at the time. So what we did in the publication is we tried to look at how the internet is reshaping the abilities to collect, store, process, and analyze information. We look at the individual legal regimes in a contrasting range of countries, from the US to China to Nigeria to Mexico, to show how different countries think about these things. And insofar as there are international standards, which are probably most developed within the European Convention on Human Rights and the jurisprudence of the European Court on Human Rights, we look at international, transnational standards. So I think the conclusion we came to is that, firstly, if you think about what the intelligence services do, they do probably about 1/10 of the information processing about people that companies do. The whole business model of the internet currently and how it makes money is based on the collection, processing, storage and sale of our personal information. So if we really think that's a serious issue, we will need to think, I think, conceptually very differently about the ownership of our data. So instead of our data being owned by companies who we give it to them as part of availing ourselves of their service, that we retain ownership of that data and we license companies to use it for explicit purposes that we agree to. That would be a fundamental paradigm shift in the business model of the internet, and that would also shift the way that personal data is held and stored by governments. If it was seen as the personal property of the citizen, and the citizen consented through a series of agreements to the licensing of that data or use of that data, that I think could take us some way forward. But we are some way away from that situation. And I think our conclusion is that the current national systems for regulating privacy and the outdated regulations we have around data protection aren't really sufficient to tackle the problems of privacy in the modern world. So I think what the UNESCO publication does is it's a very good base analysis of the current situation. It sketches out the problems, but in a sense it does no more and can do no more than set an agenda for future discussion and future policy debate.
Thanks a lot. And it's in March, as Andrew said, the publication was launched before the Snowden scandal, and they produced the research before that. And this is also related to another area of UNESCO functions, is that it will be work as a laboratory of ideas, trying to see problems that are not well defined yet, but how we can introduce this kind of debates in the international epistemic communities and others. So, Amalia, your comments, please, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I think I can help you also to deal with your nightmare, because these publications are actually quite useful for civil society, as the organization I work is an advocacy organization, and it's not the same for us to say all that is in these publications with the name of UNESCO, because we can say it, but governments are not going to listen to us. But if we have the backup of the UNESCO with this publication, it makes our voices stronger and make them to listen to us. But I specifically wanted to talk about the publication on bringing digital safety for journalism, as in the last year or a little bit more, I've been working specifically on digital safety for journalists in Colombia. And this publication, I can say that it came after what I was doing at that time in Colombia, doing a diagnosis on what's the situation for journalists in Colombia in terms of digital safety or digital threats and violence. And I can say I confirm whatever is there is exactly the same things that we observe in Colombia with journalists. But later on, we wanted to deal with women journalists, what is happening with women journalists in Colombia. And this publication gave me the insight that I needed to start looking at that problem. So it was actually really, really helpful for us in Colombia to have this publication, to understand the issues from a global perspective and just bring into our local context situation and make everyone, all partners, all stakeholders and the government to listen to us with more strong support from this kind of publication. So I'm going to be very short because, you know, we're short of time.
Thanks, Amalia. So Eduardo started saying about the connection with the academic world, and then Rebecca mentioned two important stakeholders. The publications can help to hold regulators and states accountable on the things that we are concerned about, and also the influence on the private sector, for instance, with the intermediary publications. And Andrew mentioned this role of laboratory of idea and taking some issues. And now, Amalia, how civil society can advantage of UNESCO seal, of UNESCO logo, to use those publications to also make some advocacy and to discuss those issues with different stakeholders, particularly the government, when very complicated issues like journalists, safety and security are at stake. So, as you note, the APC chair was here from the beginning to gatekeep and guarantee that we were going to respect the time. And we are most glad the UNESCO delegation team that is here, not only myself, Chang Hong. There you have our regional director, Lydia Adalto, that if you need to discuss some things about the publications and follow-ups, we can do that later, but I think that we shouldn't... you want? Okay. So the next session is authorizing us to at least take 2 questions if they are very urgent. If you also had some kinds of nightmare, you urgently need to discuss these things like I did, but I mean... so 2 questions, perhaps, and then we close. Please.
So, John Carr from the European NGO Alliance for Child Safety Online, co-author of a report that came out last week from Chatham House and the Global Commission on Internet Governance, which established that 1 in 3 of every internet user on the planet is a legal minor. That's to say a person under the age of 18. And I wondered whether or to what extent any of the publications that you've referred to recognize the different position that minors are in relation to the whole range of issues that you've raised. Because they enjoy all of the human rights that adults enjoy, but in addition they have an extra layer of legal rights and protections which are human rights of a different kind, which impacts on privacy and free expression and things of that kind. I just wondered to what extent that specific angle had been acknowledged or taken up in any of the different wonderful publications. And by the way, I'm glad, because I'm one of these old-fashioned guys that still likes to read books, and I will do so on my flight back to London tomorrow.
If we have another question, we take it and then back to the panel for replies. Any other pressing doubts, questions, comments? Okay, so I will ask Shanghong and others if they want to comment, but before just to also mention that particularly in Latin America, with our colleagues of a UNESCO Center on Information Society that are there, Alexandra and Fabio, we are investing a lot in reproducing the model of kids online that London School of Economics implemented in Europe for Latin America. So they did the research in Brazil, and they are replicating Argentina, Chile, and other countries. So I think also it's interesting to touch bases with them, and this is the work we are doing in the region. If I were a common international bureaucrat, I would answer, this is a question for UNICEF. But since we are not, I hand the floor to Strangho so that she can comment.
Thank you, Guillaume. If I understand the question properly, actually the focus of this publication, the policy report, I think there are two. One is the interface between online and offline of the human rights, because any rights online, now they are impacting offline because the borders is really blurring. And secondly, that UNESCO just endorsed the Internet universality concept. We reaffirm the indivisibility, the universality, and the interdependence of all the human rights. So our focus, not only free expression, not only privacy, but all the other rights when they are intertwining with this fundamental freedom. So we are looking at the hate speech, we are looking at the youth radicalization, which touches upon the children, but now the children are the most internet-savvy people. As a no basis, we don't look at them. And we have organized youth forum at UNESCO. We look at how we empower young people to better practice their rights online. So it's a comprehensive approach, not only policy, not only legal, but also we talk about capacity building and awareness raising.
Thank you. And I will add on a kind of self-criticism. You are right. We should do more on this particularly age group, because youth is quite covered and teenagers. But what we are basically doing is insisting in several, including some of those publications, in the idea that media and information literacy are quite important as a public policy to solve this. But we should be more specific in the future on some of those challenges, particularly in the connections with the Child Convention. Thanks a lot. Thanks for APC for being so indulgent in offering some time for questions. Now I hand the floor to them, and we will be around if you have other comments and needs on our publications. Thank you very much, and thanks for the panel. Bye.